I'm a mastering engineer and I cut lacquers. And today we're here in my studio, in my mastering studio. And I want to talk about vinyl and vinyl mastering and maybe help answer some of the questions or mysteries that are out there about this black art. Because it's really not that complicated. The big barrier here is the fact that you need a lathe and tons of experience to really understand what's happening when you transfer digital or magnetic tape to a physical groove. Now let's talk a lot about all the steps, the importance of a vinyl pre-master, what vinyl mastering actually is, and some things to look out for, and why hiring a professional, an experienced professional, is always your best option when it comes to getting the best product to your listener and getting around some of the headaches that can delay your release or keep you unsatisfied with the whole experience. So let's talk about what mastering is. And mastering is really getting the album or the track ready for the format of release. And our format is vinyl. So what the mastering engineer's job is here is he transfers the audio from magnetic tape or digital, mostly all digital now, and he transfers that onto a disc into a physical groove. And a cutting stylus cuts on a lacquer the path that the stylus will follow on your turntable. And the transfer of that music embeds itself into the groove, into a physical 3-dimension domain. And the basics of it is really volume is up and down or depth, and side to side is your frequency. And those combinations are your transfer. And there can be physical limitations. Well, and there's a few things to watch out for. You know, vinyl is a really cool format and it's a lot of fun, but it's not perfect. And if you don't know what to look out for, and as a cutting engineer or an artist who's getting their record made, if you don't have the right ears on your project, there could be some problems. So I get most of my stuff digital, and when I get it in here, there's a few things we look for. The big thing, has it been properly prepared for vinyl? Or do I just have a CD master that they're trying to put on record? And sometimes that's all that's available. But has it been properly prepared for the transfer? And this is a term we call pre-master because it's digitally preparing the file, the audio file, to be ready to cut into lacquer. So there's a few things we need to look out for. Obviously, we need the volume to be in the analog signal chain. A lot of digital levels way exceed what the technology of the 1960s could accomplish. So that's a big important thing. You know, you need to make sure your reference level is playing in the analog domain, which can be quite a few dB lower than what we're used to with digital formats. The other big thing we look for is the phase relationship between the content, between left and right channel, and how they respond to each other. Because this is really important in vinyl. Because it affects the physical playback. Because the groove is in 3 dimensions, it's going up, down, side to side, moving so fast. Um, if there are phase problems between the left and right channel, they can cause very audible problems, skips, distortions, and all sorts of things that can ruin equipment, cutting equipment, playback equipment, where if phase relationship isn't gonna, if the phase relationship isn't correct in the digital domain, it's only going to affect the speakers and what's coming out and the sound. The playback device will never malfunction because of this, but in vinyl it will. So there's some things we need to look out for, and it's high frequencies and low frequencies will cause skips and their phase relationship. So you need an experienced professional that understands how this transfer works, so you develop a feeling after you've done it for a long time and a sense about how your machine operates. So when we first put on something, we look to see, has it been properly prepared by somebody who's experienced? And a lot of that is the consolidation of tracks from side A to side B, because we want to make sure the artist has approved all the gaps and all the silences and the running order before it gets to the lathe, because there can always be a human error. If you send individual tracks, you send your 12 tracks and they aren't laid out perfectly, their mistakes happen. Maybe a song is mislabeled. So it's always good to have a digital proof first of side A and side B, and exactly having a detailed document describing, we call it a cue sheet. And this document is your timings and your track markers, your start and your stop, and where each song will change. The cutting engineer doesn't always get to listen or have a sense of what the record is. So if there's a gapless album, songs run into each other, the engineer's not always going to know the exact point to make that happen. So it's always good to have the artist involved or the producer when making these decisions. So this should happen before, during the vinyl pre-master. Now, once everything's been looked at and assessed, then we're ready to cut the lacquer. Now, the lacquer is a blank disc. It's 14 inches, and it's an aluminum plate, I think, covered in a lacquer material, and it's heavily refined and made to be able to cut audio into it and have very little noise, almost none, when you play it back. It's a special substance. It's a polymer. It's been developed, and they have special recipes that are closely guarded. And so when we get this disc ready, we put it down and we start to cut the path of the record. This is all done in real time. You can't stop the lathe from spinning. You can't pause it. Once the needle goes down and the turntable is spinning, you have started the job. So you need to make sure everything is prepared. And so the engineer isn't always going to listen to everything at this stage intensively or inherently, knowing where the artist had planned or had vision, because they're not in the studio with them. But it is our job to make sure that that groove, when played back, translates the same way to the listener in his living room that the band and the producer signed off in the recording studio. That feeling needs to be common. And the sound needs to be at the same levels. So you need to navigate some of these issues, and we cut the lacquer. The mastering engineer cuts the single lacquer, and he cuts one lacquer per side, because you think when these lacquers go further down and they get made into plates and they go into a record press, you've got your top stamper and your bottom stamper, and they're pushing to make your record. So you have to buy two lacquers or purchase 2 lacquers to really start the process of vinyl manufacturing. Now, this is how you start. This is how your production run starts. It's the last creative step. It's the first manufacturing step. So once the mastering engineer has prepared his equipment, reviewed the content, gets his lacquer ready, he's ready to go. You're not making a lot of changes on the fly. You have to decide and be consistent beforehand, because you can't have variations throughout an album. The artist won't be happy, the producer won't be happy. And if it wasn't intended by them, then the listener won't be happy either. So after the mastering engineer has cut the lacquer, has cut the groove on a blank disc, and you can see it now. It looks like a record. It's a little bit bigger because of the manufacturing steps that come next. But essentially the 12-inch record inside is the record. And that audio does not get played again because the lacquer is so soft that any playback can deteriorate and change the shape of the groove, which will alter the sound on further playbacks. So we want to keep that groove as pristine as possible. So the engineer cutting studio has special preparations they take, and they're very basic, but we keep it clean and climate controlled to protect the grooves. But the main thing is it does not get played. So having somebody work on it beforehand that knows what they're doing is essential in this step, because there is some guesswork. We don't get to listen to the album until a test pressing is made. And in order to make a test pressing, you have to get a negative. So the lacquer then goes to a plating facility and they make a negative, and I have one right here. This is what is called a stamper. And the groove is a negative image. And if you feel it, the groove actually stands up out of the stamper. And this is what we call a negative. Now, we make these negatives because the lacquer is so soft. And this transfers it into something strong that can make multiple copies. But there's limits. You make about 1,000 records with a pair of stampers. Some guys say more, some guys say less, but today we're going to say around 1,000, depending on what you're pressing. But the cutting engineer doesn't make this. A secondhand, a subtrade, or another business who specializes in this takes the torch. Now, there's some things that can happen in this process, but mostly they're related to noise floor, maybe brittle playbacks. But if done correctly, the sound quality should be pristine when pressed into a record. I guess I missed a step. These stampers, I talked about it briefly before, but these stampers then get shipped to your record pressing plant. The record pressing plant takes these, puts them in their record press, and adjusts the settings so that this cleanly presses a puck of PVC with the grooves clearly played and adhered, really, to the PVC puck, and now it's become a vinyl record. And so this is all done when it's really hot, and so it transfers. You know, it's pretty crazy how this all happens and how they figured this all out. But most people don't know that all these steps are involved when you press a record. I've had friends and acquaintances come in here and look at my lathe and say, "Oh, what a cool record press!" And we just it's education a lot of times because this format is been brought back. The systems no longer are familiar, but a lot of it is think like film and developing film. You need to get your negative, and you use your negative to make your prints. And so this is kind of like the camera or the developing room, let's say. And it is our job to be invisible, but also accurate and precise. You don't want to hear that it's been transferred to vinyl or changed or manipulated into a new format. But what you want to do is highlight the special features of that format. And with vinyl, it's a dynamic range, it's a warmth, it's a pleasant saturation at times, if you will, depending on your playback setup and how hi-fi you want to go, or clean or natural your playback system wants to be, or if you go tube. There's a lot of things, directions you can go when you're in that realm. But we want to focus here on the transfer and making sure that it transfers and plays at the best, the best quality for the listener and for the label and for the artist and the producer to say, this is exactly what we wanted our listener to hear. Without distortions, without playback issues, skips, lifts, tracking issues, or noise floor. There's a lot of things to work on. But all of these things are mostly done at the lathe. The pressing plant can't change the grooves on the record. Once the lacquer's cut, we've committed to the next step. For now. That's why we do a test pressing. Always, and I always encourage it. But these are, a lot of this all goes back to having a proper vinyl pre-master prepared. And it can circumvent a lot of the issues that you're going to have. They know what to look out for. They, when preparing these, and I say they, master a good, experienced cutting engineer. And you don't necessarily need to have a lathe to have this experience, but you need to have cut records or worked with it extensively for a long time. When you see a groove and how it dances under a microscope, and we look at the grooves on every record we cut, you start to learn how really the mechanics of it work, and the stylus follows this path. Now, this is a unique thing too. It's the limitations of vinyl. It's got time constraints. The longer, because the wider the groove is, because basically when the audio gets louder, the groove gets wider. And that limits your physical space on a disc. If you have bigger, wider grooves, you're going to be able to fit less grooves on your 12-inch record. So there's some things to navigate, but we also have limitations of the analog ceiling. And, it's 0 VU. And, there's certain effects that we can achieve by overdriving that, but the standard listener doesn't want that experience. So We try to keep everything below that because we don't want distortions, and it's audible and you can hear it, and it's not always pleasing. If it's classical music or it's jazz or soft folk, distortions aren't going to work. And so you've got to keep everything below, and you've got to fit all these grooves on in your set time. So your running time is really important, and it has a hand-in-hand relationship to your overall volume, obviously. The louder your record, the less space you have after your grooves are cut. So that's something to consider. It's not, I think CDs, they have a physical time limit, 60 or 70 minutes. And, streaming and data now has become just so expansive. There's no limits to any of that. But a record, you're going to run out of time, and you're going to have to change that record if you want to continue listening. So volume's really important, but the cutting engineer should be able to manage that. And a good cutting engineer wants your record to sound great because it's good for them too. And they're usually hired by the pressing plant or the record label because they're trusted. And these things are important, but often not understood. And a good cutting engineer will be able to prepare your material to be released and, cut it to be released and help you navigate that process as a customer's perspective, whether that customer be a record label, an artist, or a pressing plant. Some of the other limitations in vinyl, they come from playback, mechanical issues. As the groove gets closer to the center, the rotation becomes much slower than it is at the outside. And it's the physics of it. But this slower rotation and tighter angle of the groove can sometimes increase distortion. We call this inner groove distortion. And it happens when levels get too loud on the inner grooves of the record. Typically, back in the day, the song structure of an album would be determined because of this, because records were the only way to put out music mostly. So you wouldn't have your loudest tracks on the inside of the record. You'd start your album with the loudest tracks, and as you got closer to the inside, you'd play your softer tracks. Not necessarily all the time, but that was it. It was kind of an understanding. And if you could maximize your listener experience, this was a way to do it. So bands, mostly producers, record labels would encourage bands to make these decisions. And, they were all to enhance the listening experience. And because they're essential because of the limitations of vinyl. So having an experienced engineer in your hands, in your court, to help you navigate these things that maybe you weren't aware of is essential and highly recommended. By they, I say the cutting engineer, the mastering engineer, they will know, they should know the limitations and the possibilities of what you were trying to achieve. And when I cut records, I'm not ever coming in to save a project. Really, sometimes those things happen, and they're usually due to physical limitations. But I don't approach it like that. I haven't been hired to resurrect this or save it. It needs to, I need to maximize the sweet spots of the format that we are using. And I need to kind of navigate through the difficulties that come in this format. There are a few. I've discussed many of them. But one of the important things with vinyl is because of the time it takes to do the whole manufacturing process and go to the 3 other facilities for production: lacquer cutting, electroplating to make the negative or the stamper, and the pressing facility. It's a good thing. It's an old world thing. It gives the project some time, and it allows the people working on it to step back. And that pause can always be important when you're, the journey of making an album and being able to reflect and assess that process. It's always important to take a bit of time off. And so vinyl's really cool, and it allows you that, and you have to commit to it. When you get it, you have to wait. It comes in the mail. You have to pick it up. It's a very ritualistic experience for an artist. And I've been on both sides of the glass. And in the studio, I've been the musician. I've been the producer. I've been the cutting engineer. And I've worked at I've worked at a couple pressing plants too. So I know their approach as well too. Everybody's got, different things they want to do. Some people they want to make money. They want to keep the artist happy. So developing a good team is always important. Most people out in the business are phenomenal. All the pressing plants are really incredible. I work for a lot of them. I work for a handful of record labels and brokers. They're really fun. They're really more passionate about the sound quality and the potential. And the artists are always great to work with too, because they take everything so deeply and so passionately. And we love working for everybody in the game, and it's a lot of fun. Our lathe is fairly busy. We're cutting every week. Everything from indies to major releases, and it's a lot of fun. We've cut, I'd say I probably cut over 5,000 records on this lathe, and I've been cutting records for 12 years. We're the only cutting studio in Western Canada. There's a handful of cutting studios now out east, and it's growing. There was a time when I was the only cutting studio in the country, which, just shows the growth of the industry. But I think it's important to just get out and talk about the processes involved, kind of what it's like for a cutting engineer from my perspective, the things I look for, the things that I value in the whole process: getting a vinyl pre-master, hiring the cutting engineer directly if you can. I think is always an important thing if you're the artist, if you're the label, if you're the pressing plant. The customer, it gives you first contact of the audio professional. So you don't have to feel like you're being pushed around by a sales guy or yes man. You've got somebody who's been through the whole process many times, knows what to look out for, knows how to maximize the potential of the format, and be your point person for complicated issues if they do arise with pressing issues or plating issues. And but we all work together. There's not a ton of mystery behind it. Really, the big barrier is there's not many lathes left. They still keep popping up, but they're not manufactured anymore. And you really need to just cut records to understand it. We can talk about the process, but you have to see it. And where you are at as a cutting engineer from your first week or your first few cuts to a few years into when you've cut a few thousand records, it really changes. And you develop a second sense, as any engineer should. And there's things that you can just feel when you hear it instantly. You're going to go, okay, I might have problems with these hi-hats today. So that's what you're going to do on your test cut, and you're going to maybe focus in a little bit on that. But you're going to keep things short because you have to be transparent and you have to keep production moving. So you can't spend all day cutting one side. It's just not feasible. So I hope this helps you understand the time and the effort put in from a cutting engineer and the perspective of a cutting engineer, and kind of a more detailed approach about what they do, and it as a specific in the whole pressing experience. And records, I think, are an incredible way to listen to music. I feel it's like the hard cover book. There will always be a dedicated audience who likes to deep listen. And when you can experience something that's multisensory, and that's what vinyl is, you have to take time, energy, and effort to consume it. And it's not just an audio experience. There's all kinds of immersion when it comes to the artwork, the whole ritual of playing a record, cleaning the record, getting your turntable ready. That is just will always be a constant for the market that values those things. And it's really cool and really exciting to be a part of. I don't know if this is a podcast or what this is, but I'm going to start talking about the things that I do here at my studio, and explaining it more, because I am just thrilled by all of it, and I can't wait to share it with you all. So thank you, and cheers.